So very briefly, for those of you that know nothing about myself, I'm Jeff Wilkinson. I'm Managing Director of Wilkinson Construction Consultants. I'm the guy that writes the Building Regs column in Architects Journal. As a company, Wilkinson Construction Consultants now have been going for 10 years. We've got over 12 staff, plus a group of 6 consultants that work for us as well. And we cover the whole of London and the South East. We work on projects from small domestic extensions up to large commercial properties. We, for example, dealt with the headquarters of Scania UK. We're currently working with Nestle, but we're also more than happy to work with small domestic developments as well. Anyhow, enough of the pitch. You're not here for that. You're here to find out a bit about regulations. What are regulations? In their simplest form, regulations are society's way of telling us that we won't do what we're supposed to do unless we punish you for not doing them. That's essentially what they are. They go back all the way to biblical times. One of my favourite quotes is this one from Deuteronomy, which basically says, when you build a new house, you must build a railing around the edge of its flat roof. That way you won't be considered guilty of murder if someone dies because they fall from the roof. I always think that that's a good, subtle way of starting your day. If you can go home at the end of the day and nobody has died as a result of your designs, that's a success. I think that's a great start point from there. Of course, for some, that's not actually been the case. We go back to Grenfell Tower just over 2 years ago now, and people didn't go home alive at the end of the day thanks to design work that people have been done. And that's what's really focused us and brought us to the event here today. We've seen Dame Hackett's report, and in the next few days we're going to hear various updates from phase 1 of the Grenfell inquiry. Dame Hackett concluded that the system as it currently stands is simply not fit for purpose. So she proposed a series of changes. So the way in which the new system of building regulations is going to work, and we still await the final details and the consultation papers and other bits and pieces. According to the government, they're quite busy dealing with something else at the moment. I'm still not sure what that is, but they will eventually get round to sorting that. And then when they've got that sorted, they'll actually produce the legislation for this. It was confirmed in the Queen's speech that it will be dealt with in this next session. So we will see something coming forward. And you can book yourselves in for that event by filling in the feedback form at the end of today's session. So what does the new system propose? Well, the system proposes a series of gateway points. Now, what does that mean in practice? It means at the very least that you need to start engaging with building control far earlier than perhaps you have in the past. For example, the first gateway point is planning permission. So you shouldn't actually progress through planning consent without having something that's practical to build. So you should have, in practical terms, outline building control approval for the scheme at that point in time, so that it's possible for you to build it. Now, quite often we've dealt with blocks of flats, for example, where the design of the flats incorporates, for example, a single staircase, and it is simply not possible to build to the number of flats and the layout that you've actually got. So although you've had a project that's obtained planning consent, it physically cannot be built at the end of the day. So it's that we're in part trying to avoid. And secondly, within that, we're looking to ensure that the fire service access is going to be adequate. The second gateway point is the full plans approval. Hopefully, as part of this, the whole concept of the building notice will be going out of the window, and it will be a requirement that you submit effectively a full plans application. Now, that full plans application will require full approval of the fire safety strategy. So before you can start on site, all of the key fire safety items must have been approved by building control and the fire service before the first dig on site. Now, that's going to be quite an important change, particularly for contractors who will struggle to get their heads around this concept. They will not be able to start on site until that approval is in place. And the idea is that that approval will act as something called a golden thread that will continue throughout the whole of the process and will be handed over at the end of the project. Now that should mean that as architects, you have a far greater role going forward than you previously have. Because within that, prior to occupation, any change that has occurred, whether it's material or layout, will effectively need to have been done on the plans, resubmitted to building control and reapproved. In fact, there is a suggestion that there will be stop notices that will prevent a contractor progressing if they've diverged on site from what is on the approved plans. So you can see that this is a really fundamental change to the way in which building control currently operates. It's far more of a system of checks before works are allowed to progress. Now, initially, when this was proposed, it was proposed only for buildings over 18 stories in height. Then they've proposed that it's likely to be buildings over 11 stories in height. And they've also proposed that several of these changes, including probably the full plans approval part, will be dependent upon the use and nature of the building. I've heard examples where any building over 60 people would potentially be caught by this new system. We await the consultation process, and obviously we'll update you on that. But the important thing is to start thinking like this now. So what have RIBA done? I'm sure you're all familiar with the RIBA plan of work. Of course you are, Jeff. Of course we are. We know all about the RIBA plan of work. There's not a day goes by where we don't have this on the wall looking at it. Well, if you look at this in a day-to-day basis, you'll see that there's almost no reference whatsoever to any of these key points or the interactions with building control. So RIBA have produced this version, which I'm sure you do genuinely have a copy of course you do. And you are now working to. So this is the new RIBA plan of work, which includes all of these key phases and indicates the point at which you should be interacting with building control going forwards. If you are not currently working to this, you're not legally required to, but if you're going to work forward in terms of best practice and get yourselves ready and geared up for what will be coming, then I strongly recommend that you look at this. It's over the 2 slides, so we've got the full details there. If anyone doesn't have a copy of this and would like a copy of it, I can send that out after the event today. So that covers a lot of the procedural bits and pieces that have been happening and will be happening going forwards. So the next thing that I'm going to take a look at is the approved documents themselves. By way of background, since 2013, the government have been updating the style of the approved documents. They've been trying to make them clearer, more user-friendly. By 2019, there was a whole series of those approved documents that were in that format. In 2013, the government were criticised for not updating approved document B to that new format. And the coroner at Lakenhall House specifically said that approved document B was so difficult to understand that even professionals struggled to understand it. It was simply, again, not fit for purpose. Then government minister responsible for building regulations, Eric Pickles, replied in a specific response from the government to the coroner that it would be done by 2017. Unfortunately, as we know, it wasn't done by 2017 and Grenfell Tower occurred. So could the government have done more? Well, certainly that is the case. The government was certainly aware of the situation. They had commissioned a whole series of reports. For those of you that follow my column in Architects Journal will have seen that I mentioned the fact that there's what we're referring to as the legacy reports. There was a series of work done by BRE in 2014 through to 2016, which updated all of the research work for the approved documents. And within that, they covered things like fire spread, particularly within cavities of buildings. Although not directly related to Grenfell Tower, you would think, just wait till you see some of the stuff that comes out from the inquiry to see how relevant some of this information actually is. So what has happened since then? Well, in the end of last year, in December, we had the change to approved document B relating to fire spread on the external cladding. What is generally referred to in public parlance as the combustible material ban. It's not quite a combustible material ban, but it's very similar to a combustible material ban. Here is the version of the approved document before last December, and here is the version after. You will struggle to see any difference in the regulation itself. In fact, you'll struggle to see much in the way of any difference in the guidance diagram itself either. It's not until you actually progress on and you start looking in detail that you'll see that what has happened is that in the notes to the diagram, they've added a subclause saying that where Regulation 7 applies, Regulation 7 takes precedence. And Regulation 7, which is this bit on materials and workmanship, is where the ban actually sits. Now, bear in mind that the coroner criticised how difficult it is to actually follow the approved documents. It seems somewhat strange that the government have chosen to deal with a combustible ban, which is so important in everyone's mindset, by a footnote to a diagram in an otherwise unchanged document. That doesn't seem like they've dealt with it with the clarity that's actually required. And for architects in the room, some of these very subtle little changes can have a massive, massive implication. For example, I don't know if there's anyone here that's dealing with buildings over 18 stories in height at the moment, but we have a couple on our books. The combustibles ban has banned plastic air bricks in the external envelope. It's banned the use of cavity trays, for example. It's banned effectively the use of plastic weep holes. Dealing with cavity trays as an example, because there is no preformed plastic cavity tray out there that complies, contractors are now having to pre-form aluminium or metal pressed cavity trays in order to ensure that the products are non-combustible. Something as simple as an adhesive to fix a brick slip does not comply with the combustibles ban, and the brick slips are now having to be mechanically fixed back. The implications of what seemed like a very simple footnote to a diagram are huge for the construction industry. What has then happened is that we've seen a series of fires in the external balconies of buildings. You will have seen earlier this year the Barking fire. What you may not have been so aware of is that you had an almost identical fire just down the road at Holborough Lakes, probably 2 years before that. Nothing was done at that point in time, and yet an almost identical fire had occurred and wiped out a building. As a result of that, the government produced an advisory note. Now, these are really interesting pieces of guidance. If you go to the government's website, you'll see a whole series of these advisory notes. Now, these have no regulatory backing, but have huge consequences. For example, the government introduced an advisory note that said that all fire risk assessments should now consider the external cladding on buildings. We've heard from a number of mortgage lenders that they are ceasing to lend unless the fire risk assessment has actually been updated with that full cladding details. Now, we've worked on buildings before, and we are aware of a number of them where they haven't yet carried that out on private dwellings, so those that are not in the public sector ownership, and they are still waiting for that to be carried out. So at the moment, it is not possible for the tenants to actually sell their property as it stands at the moment. So some of these implications are huge. The government then, in July, set out a letter that spoke about requirement B4 and basically turned around and said that as architects you should do all that you can, regardless of what the regulations say, to ensure that you consider fire safety within the buildings and in the external envelope. Regardless of height, regardless of anything else, you should have due concern to it. What they're effectively saying is that designing to meet the regulations is not sufficient. What you have to bear in mind is that building regulations are effectively the equivalent of an MOT for a building. Would you design a car to just pass the MOT standard? Would you be looking at designing a car that had 3 millimeters of tread on it, that had the basic brakes that can stop you before you go there? No, you wouldn't. You'd be looking to go way beyond that. So yes, it might pass the equivalent of the MOT test, but will it actually deliver what's required? So what's happened since then? There's been a consultation on approved document B, and the intent has been to actually review that document and make it far more useful. Interestingly, the government have said that there are no technical changes within the new approved document B. It's predominantly stylised. There were over 1,300 individual comments and changes that were reviewed. Those consultation responses are set out there. In terms of those that were important were highlighted in red, amber and green. I'm not going to go through all of those, you'll be pleased to hear. What have they actually done? Well, what they've actually done is things like this. Previously, the guidance for stretched ceilings said, the ceiling of a room may be constructed either as a suspended or stretched skin membrane from panels of thermoplastic materials of TPA flexible classification, provided that it is not part of a fire-resisting ceiling, and each panel should not exceed 5 metres square in area and should be supported on all sides, which I think was fairly clear to start off with. I think we could all follow that. But what they've done now is they've simplified that and said the ceiling may be constructed from TPA flexible materials. Each panel should meet the following conditions: maximum area of 5 metres squared and supported on all sides. So you should actually find it's now easier to follow the new approved documents than it was before. So we've tried to simplify the English throughout the whole of this process. One of the things that you'll see first of all is that they have now split the way in which the approved documents work. Previously, it was just dwellings in approved document 1 and flats were contained in volume 2. What they now have done is they've moved all of the dwellings, so including flats, into volume 1 and commercial buildings effectively in volume 2. They have undertaken some improvements in the way they reference the external fire spread. They've started to take out some of the European classifications and references to British standards where they start to conflict to each other. Depending on what happens in the next week or so, that will determine how much of an exercise we then have to do looking forwards at harmonising standards in future. They've looked at the guidance on fire dampers, and that's an area where there is some new guidance that's actually been included. So there's no new requirement, but there is some new guidance in there. And they've moved the information about Regulation 38 to a new section as well. So the new layout is now as follows. So effectively, it still works in the same way. Requirement B1, B2, B3, B4, B5. Regulation 38 has its own section, and then you have a new series of appendices. Looking at the main changes, if you look inside the front of the document, you'll see a brief list of the principal changes. And as you'll see, they're not actually that high. But what you will start to see is some particularly interesting changes. If you go to the PDF is now clickable. If you look at the guidance document itself and you see something in green and you click on that, it will take you through to that reference. So if it says something like habitable room and you're not sure on what a habitable room is, you simply click on the term habitable room and it will take you to that cross-reference. In future, we hope that this will also include references to British standards, etc. It will cross-reference you direct to those. What you will have to do is to undertake a great exercise in playing spot the difference. If you look at the old version, which we have over here, and the new version over there, you will struggle to actually spot the differences. But if you look really, really, really closely, you'll reference here that the large dwelling house should have a grade B fire alarm, and under the new version, it now says a grade A fire alarm. It's subtle differences like that that you're looking out for throughout the whole of the process. And obviously that's where we can help you to identify what these changes are and what the implications are. There's some new clearer guidance on loft conversions, for example. So it says in paragraph 2.23 about the approach. So if you have got an unprotected lower floor, it talks about the options that you have in relation to that. Also, and this one is one of the ones that you probably aren't familiar with, but technically has been there for some length of time. This is the guidance for ducts. So if you have a duct that runs through a protected stair, for example, an extract fan from an individual flat that's running through it, it confirms what the guidance is for running extracts and ducts through a protected stair. And it sets out the three options, which are effectively the fire and smoke damper, not just a fire damper, but a fire and smoke damper, a protected duct or fire resisting enclosure to that duct. So it sets those out, and again we can explain more of that should you need to have any assistance. It has set out this advisory note has now been dropped into the regulations itself. So one of the things that we really want to try and get across today is that in relation to buildings of any height or any use, architects should give consideration to the materials of choice, including extent and arrangement used in the external wall or attachments to the wall to reduce the risk of fire spread over that wall. So even though the ban doesn't apply to the building that you are dealing with, as part of your design risk assessment, you should consider what the effect of fire spreading over that surface actually is and whether there is a risk. So you need to start considering in some depth what materials you're using, whether or not the regulations apply, which is a big move forwards in terms of liability. Regulation 38 now has a clearer section. Now this is one of the things that we struggle with getting out from most projects. And this is part of where the golden thread actually comes into play. And this is where as architects, your involvement should continue through to the completion of the project. It shouldn't be simply that you prepared an architectural pack, off goes the builder, and you never see the thing after that. What is required is that all of the fire safety information, all of the design that you have put in place to begin with is preserved as a golden thread through to the end. If there are any changes during the course of the construction, they need to be recorded on the fire safety plans and resubmitted at the end. If these are not submitted going forwards, it will not be possible to occupy that building. So it is really, really important that the contractors moving forward keep in touch with the designers to ensure that that's preserved, updated and maintained. As I say, it's likely that there will be stop notices introduced. So if as building control we see these deviations on site, we can actually turn around and go, you cannot progress until the architects put that on the drawing and has been submitted to us and agreed with the fire service. What else do we have? We have in the guidance at the back, you had lots of columns which had European standards, UK standards, and gave confusion as to what the relevant standard actually was. So they've now simplified those tables to make it clearer. They've also put in a new Appendix E, which highlights the situations where sprinklers are set out as options and what those sprinkler options are in terms of how you can use them to get variations. It also sets out what those sprinkler requirements actually are, because there are different standards for different sprinkler systems. Again, we're there to help you with that. One thing to look out for: who downloaded the PDF from the government's website when it was first published? Yes, of course you did, because you all had your fingers on the pulse, you were straight away there. Well, one of the problems was that when it was first released, it actually had some incorrect information in it. So it has been republished in probably the last 3 or 4 weeks. So if you previously downloaded it, please now go down and download the correct version, because as I say, there are a series of mistakes in it. And those core mistakes are with regard to smoke control dampers, the double skinned roof sheeting, the references to large dwelling houses and fire alarms, and doors on escape routes. In fact, principally the main changes that I've actually drawn your attention to today, the things that have actually changed, there were a series of typos within them. So please make sure that you've got the right version. If you are not sure that you're working to the correct version, then please contact us and we'll make sure that you are. So what's next? Well, we've got a series of reviews out at the moment, changes to Part L, Part M, and bizarrely, there's a review of Part B. Yes, having gone through all of this process and updated the document in a new, easy to read format, we're now going to go through the process of changing it all over again. And there are some even more major changes proposed as part of that. So, for example, there are some key fire safety construction details. So in the same way that we have approved construction details for thermal and sound, for example, they're going to be producing approved construction details for fire stopping and cavity barriers. They're reviewing the purpose groups. One of our biggest bugbears is the fire service's interpretation of what is a house in multiple occupation and what isn't a house in multiple occupation. We have completely differing views from different fire services on this. So that's one of the areas that they're going to be reviewing. Access and facility for the fire service. As a result of what's happened at Grenfell Tower, the fire service have gone out and have started to review the kit that they've actually got. So one of the proposals is that they will be looking at whether or not access to buildings as it's currently designed actually is suitable for the type of appliances, for example, that they're now utilising. And also how the fire service actually access buildings and the way in which they are used. There is a lot of discussion in recent weeks over stay put. You'll have seen a whole series of claims in recent days about the fire service's approach to the evacuation of Grenfell Tower. The evacuation strategy currently still remains as stay put and has worked over 5,000 times correctly since 2014. So the intention is not that we're going to abandon the stay put policy. However, the government are reviewing whether or not that remains the most appropriate route, and also whether or not single stair building is actually going to be suitable to enable the fire service to tackle a fire whilst at the same time evacuating people out. Now, it may be that what they will do is they will look at, for example, utilising evacuation lifts or providing a second access lift to the building. But there are a whole series of changes coming. There is also a draft British standard out there that is being reviewed and is looked at in Scotland at the moment that will enable you to sign off with a non-stay put policy within a block of flats. But at the moment, the requirement is and remains that you design to the British Standard 5839, which requires that you adopt a stay put policy in all new blocks of flats. So please don't diverge from that at the moment. So that brings me to perhaps the final and most important change. And if there's anything that you take away from today, I think it's this: that the government have committed themselves to the all-important question of the low-level letterbox. Yes, that's right. We have managed, in amongst all of the Brexit debate, to find parliamentary time to discuss the issue of posties backs. No longer will it be acceptable for posties to have to bend down to put their post through the letterbox at low level, and a new building regulation is on its way, setting out a minimum requirement that the letterbox will be between 900 and 1500 millimetres from floor level. So there you are. We've concluded, we've taken a small trip through some of the changes, some of the highlights, and I think we can all take away that one very important point, if nothing else. I've been Jeff Wilkinson. Thank you for listening. Cheers. Okay, so there's actually an interesting statement there, because at the moment, the way in which the regulations work are that the date at which you submitted a particular application is the document that's relevant to that. So what we would normally suggest is that you download a copy and you make a note of the date relevant to it. Okay, so for example, if you're working pre-December, then the relevant document would have been the pre-December version. From December to July, it's the new version, and then there's another version to come beyond that, because otherwise it can become very confusing, because you will have gone through a process of design, you'll have got to site and you're currently building, a new approved document has now been released, and all of a sudden you're in the process of then reviewing it. You go, oh, hang on a second, this is completely the wrong British standard, I should be using that standard. Because in this particular version, compared with the previous version, I appreciate that the technical standard hasn't changed dramatically, but the actual layouts, etc. have. When they used to do that, when they were in the original format, then it was a relatively simple task. In fact, I used to write for Trada, and I used to do every time they updated one, I'd do a table of the changes and a table of the new bits. And it's a relatively simple process to go, these words have changed in that. But in this, the whole document has changed. So everything that was previously in volume 2 relating to flats has now moved into volume 1.
So it's still on a wholesale change, make it all red. But the next one after that is
hopefully they will.
Wholesale
Hopefully
change.
they will.
You'll have more incremental changes.
I
don't understand why it wouldn't help the digestibility of change in.
I completely agree with you, and as I say, I actually wrote to DCLG or MC, whatever they're called these days, immediately when they published the new version and said, you've not even done what you used to do, which was list inside the front cover the principal changes. So the following pages have the following changes. That is exactly what we have asked them to do, and they have now incorporated that in the reprint that they've now done. But yes, you are absolutely correct that that's a really good idea for government to do. But ultimately, it's government that produce them, and I can't overly influence their ability to do it. All I can do is go through that process with you. As I say, in this particular case, because it's such a fundamental change, it's really difficult to go through. So what I've tried to do today is to just pull out those key bits that actually go, might only be 2 words that are different, but actually have a consequential change that will affect you. Has there been a liability switch towards building control? No, I would say the liability switch is actually very much the other way. There are obviously issues over the insurance regime for approved inspectors. In particular, you will have seen that earlier in the year. But no, the key question here is not about liability for building control. In fact, invariably, almost every case that's been brought identifying in this country at least, liability against the building control body has disappeared. There is no liability to all intents and purposes to it. It's akin to saying that we're the police service and we're liable if we've failed to prevent the crime from happening. It's pretty much that kind of principle. It's about whether or not you as designers and contractors and building owners are actually competent in what you're doing. And there's a whole stream of work that's being done about competency at the moment. You'll have heard RIBA talking about introducing minimum mandatory requirements for fire safety, for example. Hopefully this morning will help towards some of that. But going forwards, it will all be about competency levels, okay? And it will be about ensuring that that happens. The requirements as they stand at the moment for building control are going to be very difficult to up. We don't have enough building inspectors and certainly not enough qualified or experienced building inspectors going forwards. So what do I expect to happen? I expect greater use of technology to go forwards on this. So I'm expecting to see drones, I'm expecting to see laser scanning, I'm expecting to see situations where the BIM model will effectively self-check for compliance as you go through so that you start to increase compliance. Again, we don't work any other industries where you appoint a third party to do it in quite that way. The responsibility, if a Boeing 747 has a design fault to it and crashes, is with Boeing. It's not with the Civil Aviation Authority. So in terms of all of this, it's important to understand that the value that you get from building control or an approved inspector is actually them sitting down and guiding you through and checking quite thoroughly what you're doing, not the ease with which you get your approval. And I think that's one of the things that Dame Hackett has highlighted in there, that a lot of the time decisions are made on appointing building control simply either on price or ease by which you'll actually get the approval and not the thoroughness of the checking process. Sorry. Okay, so the way in which, I can't really speak for local authority because I don't work within a local authority anymore. There is a local authority ombudsman that exists for local authorities. But as far as approved inspectors are concerned, we are licensed. We have a licensing body called the Construction Industry Council, who make an assessment of our competency before we're given a license to practice in any case. Then every 5 years we are audited throughout the whole of the process. So they will actually come in, they will review the systems that we have in place, the competency that we have in place, the training records that we have in place, the insurance that we have in place, and they will physically audit the projects that we've got to ensure the level of service. Now, in my opinion, at the moment, that doesn't go far enough. It doesn't give the licensing body the ease with which to withdraw licenses. It requires that they put forward an improvement plan, and it will take probably 12 months, or the company's given 12 months to put its act in order. But I do think that those powers should be increased, and I think the level of detail should be increased, and some of the technical aspects should be increased as well. And I would like to see a new licensing body for all building control, not just the approved inspector side of it, but also on the local authority side, so that there is genuinely a level playing field. And I'd also like to see far less competition on price that unfortunately does occur, and to set minimum standards of inspections. There is something called the Building Control Performance Standards Advisory Group, BCPSAG, which BCPSAG, it runs off the tongue. Building Control Performance Standards Advisory Group. So there's a set of performance standards that building control have to submit. So every year we submit those. However, since 2017 and Grenfell Tower, the government have chosen not to publish those performance standards. We have still completed them, we've returned them, the government holds that information, but it is not published in the public realm. Draw your own conclusions as to why that might be, but that is not something that you can currently have access to. So the questions I would suggest that you want to ask are the same as you would if you were appointing any other consultant within the process, and actually look at, when you're comparing one building control quote with another, what are you going to get in terms of site inspection reports? Are you going to get copies of site inspection reports with detailed photographs? Are you going to get a series of non-conformance lists coming back to you saying, we've seen this? What do you actually get back in terms of the plan check? What do you get in terms of follow-up throughout the process? Where is the value in it? How many visits have they actually carried out? Those are the questions that you would ask of any other consultant. You know, what am I going to get for my money? What advice am I going to get? Those are the things that you should be putting some value to, not just the ease with which you get the final certificate. It should realistically be the same group of consultants continued through. There will obviously be situations where that can't be the case, but there should be preservation of the original design intent, because what often happens is a design will be implemented through the planning process. It may go out to tender, and then the contractor takes over that and then basically goes through what we will politely refer to as a value engineering exercise. The value engineering exercise invariably engineers out fire safety measures, but engineers in still things like a brass bathtub. We cannot allow that to continue. We have to ensure that those first fundamental design intent requirements to ensure fire safety are maintained through. So at the very least, we'll need a version of the Reg 38 fire safety plans to have been implemented and approved, and for that to continue all the way through. Even if it does mean that another company picks it up, they will have to continue with that original document, and any changes they implement to that will go back through the control process. So it'll be a proper change control process. Again, that forms part, so I wasn't focusing overly on the procedural aspects, but the government are looking at all of these. As you know, I have major concerns about the way that the building control industry has gone. I don't like, for example, even the fact that a company is doing both the warranty inspections and the building control inspections. I don't like a situation where you've got a company within part of its parent group offering the fire engineering and submitting a fire engineering report to itself. I don't like the fact that you've got companies that within their group are offering M&E services, are offering structural services, and are effectively approving their own homework. That cannot be right. Building control was always intended to genuinely be an independent body. And it's important, in my opinion, for that to continue, and I will continue to campaign for that. But that's outside of some of the bits that we're able to talk about today.